The next concept I want to talk about is the gizmo. And I'm going to select my papyrus because I happen to know that it is in my terrain somewhere. It's way over here. So I'm just going to zoom in as close to it as I can at this point in time. It's under a couple of terrains. And it happens to be within a terrain, and in a cube. So it looks like that is as close as I'm going to be able to get to it at this point in time, because it's not only is it in a terrain, but it's in a cube that's within in a sphere. So the gizmo is essentially these arrows that are sticking out of it, and then if you notice there is this really light colored gray square going around the entire object, and then we have a series of 7 buttons over here to the lower right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are these arrows. And each of these arrows, their color corresponds to a direction. So this blue arrow corresponds to Z, the red one corresponds to X, and the green one corresponds to Y. And what these arrows allow us to do is to interactively either move, rotate, or scale this object. So over here we have these 7 buttons, and we're going to focus on these right 3 buttons. So right now we have the move button selected, which is the very top button. And the move button is usually denoted by 4 arrows sticking out in all 4 directions. So because I have this move button selected, if I roll my mouse over this red arrow, it turns yellow. And when I press and hold down the left click and drag, I can move this in the X direction. And I can do the same thing with the green and the same thing with the blue. Now if I roll my mouse over certain areas, such as this one here, it turned both of the X and the Z yellow, meaning that I can move it in this plane in 2 directions. And I can do the same thing with the green and the blue one if I can get my mouse positioned just right. And right now what I need to do is actually pull this plant out of my terrain that is within a terrain that is within my cube and sphere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom all the way out so that I'm out of all of these objects and just move this object up. And remember, I can also use these side views to do the exact same thing. And there's my plant. It looks like it's out of the terrain finally. And I'm going to try to drop it onto the ground plane. Try to zoom in as close as I can to it. And I'm going to use my other views to try to accomplish that goal. And my camera also has a gizmo that allows me to get close. And I'm going to select my plant again so I can figure out exactly where it is in respect to my camera. Select my main camera. Notice how when I select my camera it centers these views. This is one of those settings that we could change in our preferences. And our papyrus just happens to be sitting on our torus. So we have a papyrus growing on our torus here. I'll try to get in a little bit closer to our plant material. The other thing that we can do is we can rescale it. And we can do that by pressing this scale button down here at the bottom, this 3rd button, and we can make the plant bigger. You notice if I roll my mouse over the Z part of it gets big, so it stretches my plant tall, only in the Z direction. If I do it in the X, it'll make it stretch out in the X direction. And if I do it in, well, that was the Y that I just did. If I do it in the X direction, it'll also do it in the X. And then in plan view, This is what it looks like. And then this middle button allows us to rotate the object. So if we want to rotate it around, we can grab this blue one here. And we have a little thing that appears here that shows us how much we're exactly rotating it. And we can spin our plant around. We can also use these others to rotate it in other directions. The other thing that we have around our object are what it's called handles. And we have this kind of this gray, whitish colored square, light gray colored square around our papyrus plant. And we have different types of handles. The first type we have is this kind here that's along the side of our box. And this will cause us to rescale also interactively only in one direction. So the direction that it gets rescaled is dependent upon the view that you're doing this in. So I'm doing it in this main camera view. So it's whatever angle that I'm in, that's the direction that's rescaling it on. If I do it in plan view, then I know that it's only rescaling it in the X and Y direction. If I do it in the side view, then I know it's in the Y and Z direction, and in the front view I know it's X and Z. The other thing we have is these handles here in the corner, and what the handles in the corner do is it tries to scale it proportionately in X, Y, and Z directions. In most cases that's what it does, and it's totally dependent on the object type and the camera view that you're in if it actually does it in all three directions. And if you're not sure, one thing you can always do is check your go to the numerics tab and then click on the size, and then as you rescale things you can see if all the numbers are moving at the same time, and then you can tell if it's doing it proportionately. The other thing that we can do with our handles is we can rotate, and we can use these handles here in the corner, which will allow us to rotate our plant material interactively if we don't want to use the buttons here. And the direction that it rotates in, again, is dependent upon the 3D view that you're in. Right now I'm in the perspective view. So if you only want to rotate in a certain direction, then you definitely want to use these other orthogonal views. The last set of buttons are these four here to the left, and they're kind of abbreviated with a P, L, G, and a V. And right now the G button is the default button that is selected. And G is the global coordinate system, or we generally call the default one. It is the one that is currently selected. The P button is the coordinate system of the parent if you have objects grouped together, and right now we don't have any objects grouped together. L is the local coordinate system of the object itself, and then V is the 3D view's coordinate system based on the camera's view looking at the object. So I'm going to default this back to G. One thing that you probably want to take note of is where our gizmo is located at. And when you create an object in view or import an object or load an object, typically the gizmo is always located at the pivot point, which is typically the center point of the object. So in this case it is the base of the plant and the center of the plant. Sometimes you'll bring in an object that you created in 3D Studio Max or SketchUp and the gizmo is way off somewhere in space. You can move and relocate that gizmo to the center point of that object or to a corner to make it easily manipulatable. Almost all view objects that were already created in view that are part of the view library will have the gizmo located at the center. So if we go to the cube and we look in our top view, you notice that the gizmo is at the center of that object. So if I move this cube over here, really can't see it because another object is blocking it. If we click on our sphere, we notice the same is true with our sphere. We can kind of see it in these other views that the gizmo is located at the center of that object. And if we click on something like terrain, it tries to put the gizmo at the center of that object, but at the base of that object. So it is at the center of this object if we look at it in plan view. But if we look at it in side view, it is at the base, the lowest point of that terrain. And it'll do the same thing with terrain 2. And let's look at some other objects here. Our granite boulder. It will try to do the same thing with our granite boulder. Put it at the center of the object, kind of like it does the sphere. Our clouds is actually a group of spheres given a voluminous material. So it tries to find the center of this group and assigns the gizmo there. So if you look at our layers list, it is just a series of spheres that have been grouped together. And then our planet will be the same way. Over here we can see it in the front view. It's actually, it looks like it's just a plane with something on it, with some polygon surfaces going on here. And it tries to center the gizmo in the center of that as well. And then our last object we're going to look at is our torus. And it places the gizmo in the center of the torus. So with all view objects, the gizmo is always located at the center, which is also the pivot point. Objects that you import, the gizmo may not be located at the center and you may have to relocate it, which I'll show you how to do in a later video tutorial.